Hey everybody. I gotta adjust my screen and everything here because just getting back to my regular hardware from my trip last week. Good to be back in my normal time zone. I have to say that the weather today um, does somewhat make me miss Arizona, but that's okay. I don't mind. I have my little space heater tucked underneath my table here tonight, so we should be all right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to class number 9 of the Watership Down class. We are coming towards the end. Fortunately, this isn't the last class, though we've come to the end of the reading. And we, as I was planning today's class, I kept thinking, "Gosh, am I glad we scheduled an extra class for next time?" And then remember, we're going to talk about the film the week after that. But before we start, I have a few announcements tonight. First, I wanted to of course, very urgent things in the sense that they're things that are happening very soon. One is Mythmoot. Been announcing Mythmoot for a while now, and it's actually happening this very weekend as is. I'm getting ready to head down to Baltimore tomorrow to see a bunch of you guys, and I'm very excited about that. For a couple of people were asking, is it still possible to register for Mythmoot? Yes, it is still possible. We can take we got clearance to take registrations right up to the end, so there is still time. Please, if you think you might want to come, might be able to join us in Baltimore this weekend, by all means come. But anyway, that's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to seeing many of you and hearing some of the papers that have emerged from our Mythgard Academy discussion. So I'm very excited about that. So that's one thing, just to remind people that Mythmoot is this weekend. The second thing, which is a thing which is almost as imminent as that, and that is the start of the spring semester at Mythgard. So we're going to be starting our classes, our regular classes, right after Mythmoot. I think this was an awesome idea of mine, by the way, to have Mythmoot happen the weekend before classes begin. But anyway, we're starting our spring semester on Monday and Tuesday, the 12th and 13th of January next week. So we have 2 literature courses that are starting up right now. The part 2 of Amy Sturgis's excellent science fiction survey class. I just can't recommend this enough to people who are interested in science fiction, or if you want to gain a grounding in science fiction, to sort of read many of the classics of science fiction. This is just the best possible context in which to do that. And of course, Tom Shippey's awesome Beowulf class, where you're going to get a chance to study Beowulf and Tolkien's take on Beowulf with, like, literally the best person on the planet to take such a class with, Tom Shippey, and to be able to hear from him about Tolkien and Beowulf. That's going to be awesome. It won't surprise you to hear that class is already coming up on setting the record for highest enrollment ever in the history of Mythgard. So don't miss out. Everybody's doing it. It's going to be awesome. So don't be the only one not attending Dr. Shippey's Mythgard class. So anyway, those 2 things coming up. You can go to our website, mythgard.org, to find more information on our upcoming spring classes. The third announcement, also imminent, though not quite so imminent as either of the first 2, but getting there, is we are soon going to be starting up the elections for the next book. As, of course, we're coming to the end of Watership Down, it is definitely time for us to decide what we're going to be discussing next. I want to just warn you to keep an eye. Those of you who are on the Council of the Wise, the Council of Nominees, your discussions will be beginning soon, and then the electors will have a chance to weigh in and decide what book or books we do next. I'm not sure what the head of the council, Dr. Powell, with the mind of metal and wheels, has in mind if we're going to be electing 1 or 2 books this time. But in any case, now is going to be the opportunity for us to decide, or for you to decide, I should say, what we're going to be talking about for the next few months after we finish Watership Down. Just one first, says Dr. Powell. Okay. one first. So we're going to be doing the next book. So keep an eye out for that. I will be very interested to see what goes on with that. Always excited to see what the next Mythgard Academy book is going to be. So let's talk about Watership Down. Should we talk about Watership Down? Let's get back to book 4, especially since I just left us at the end of class last time on the cusp of talking about the final, or almost final, and final complete, anyway, story of El-ahrairah, and really most fun, I think, story of El-ahrairah, the story of Rowsby Woof and the fairy Wogdog. So let's start off by looking at that really very excellent story. And the thing I want to focus on in looking at the story of Rowsby Woof is the depiction of rabbit culture. We've been looking at the El-ahrairah stories as kind of the standard for rabbit culture, and sort of seeing what we can learn about, kind of rabbit standards of judgment, from reading those stories. So that we're not just sort of imposing our own anthropocentric viewpoint upon the rabbit world, but really trying to understand what this story is depicting as the rabbit world sort of from the inside, and the stories of El-ahrairah are our greatest insight into that. The story of Rowsby Woof, in one sense, is kind of a fringe story. It's sort of different from the rest of them, right? There is a sense, I think, in which we don't really learn all that much new about rabbits, per se, right? In many ways, in fact, it kind of seems to me, or, well, it sort of feels to me, I guess I would say, almost like the story of the Black Rabbit of Inlay is like the climax of the El-ahrairah story. It's not the end. We know that it's not the end. Even within that story, the story of the Black Rabbit of Inlay, there was, indications that many other stories were happening, and that it, was, and that there were going to be many stories that were going to follow after that, with El-ahrairah with the starlight ears and all that kind of thing. So it's not like there was any sense of the end at the end of that. But thinking of kind of the career of El-ahrairah as we've gotten it in these stories, it really does kind of seem like a culmination. It's sort of at the end of the, where we leave El-ahrairah at the end, the interrupted end of the story of the Black Rabbit of Inlay. It's sort of hard to see exactly where does he go, what does he do from here. And the only other story that we get is the story of Rowsby Woof. And as I say, it's sort of different in character, mostly because it is so focused on that other character, that is the character of Rowsby Woof. It's a story of it's an El-ahrairah story, but it's an El-ahrairah story about how he deals with this one other character and the relationship between him and this other character, and in many ways the differences between him and this other character. It's a story of, trickery and triumph of El-ahrairah like the other stories, but it's a lot more ad hominem, or ad conem, I suppose it would be, than the other stories are. It's interesting observation. Carolyn Morehouse says it reminds her of the Tom Bombadil story. It almost seems imported from another place. That's interesting. And Jana makes a really excellent point that it has humans in it, for one, and no other story has had men. And not only that, but it is the only story that even features men. I agree, but it almost sort of the way that it acknowledges the human's point of view, right? The fact that the story kind of shifts to the perspective of the man, briefly in that story, is or at least gives us his perspective. Is another thing, Jana, that really makes it stick out to me. I agree. Philip makes a really excellent point that it's interesting that Dandelion's not familiar with this one, right? Yeah, and Philip, of course, we do have to remember that the story of Rowsby Woof is told by Bluebell and not by Dandelion. So it's the only non-Dandelion story of El-ahrairah that we get, and one wonders to what extent the fact that the story of Rousby Woof feels different, is that a kind of narrative success on Richard Adams' part, right? Because he's giving it from a different speaker, from Bluebell instead of Dandelion, who's been our narrator of El-ahrairah to this point, and so therefore we get a story that looks and feels different, because of course it would look and feel different because it's coming from a different teller. Possibly, and of course, the fact that the funniest and most outrageous story that we get comes from Bluebell also seems rather in character of Bluebell as we know him. So yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly, I think, an interesting way to look at it in that way. Chris Swank has an interesting observation, too. She says, the other stories feel as if they take place in a mythic time. Rousby Woof feels very much set in the present. Yeah, Chris, I think especially the interaction with men is, for me, the thing that really does that. I mean, but you're right. I mean, even apart from the human in the story, it's the setting too, right? Think of the difference between the gardens of King Darzan. I almost said King Kelphazin, which is the marshes, not the king. Think of the gardens of King Darzan compared to the very mundane wire fenced garden with the guard dog that we get in Rousby Woof. You're right, Chris, that doesn't have any of those elements of sort of mythic air to it, right? Until that air of, that sort of air of mythic significance is imposed upon it, right, fraudulently by El-ahrairah, with the story of, the fairy wog dog, or in the persona of the fairy wog dog. Yeah, I mean, it is different. It is different in that way. What I want to look at, and Chris, we might want to come back and think about that more a little bit later. I'm not going to fool myself into thinking I'm going to get back to this tonight. I probably won't, but we will take it up at the beginning of next time. What I do want to come back to is the way that sort of myth and legends come back into play in this story, especially at the end, not just in the epilogue, but even in the final chapters. So we're definitely going to talk about that, and I'm sure, having discussed what we have discussed and having read many of the books that we've read together, I'm sure many of the passages that that I want to talk about, which ones I mean, and I'm sure they jumped out at you as we were reading. But anyway, like I say, I'm not kidding myself into thinking I'm probably going to get to those tonight, but we'll see. But Chris, I do want to think about your point about the register of Rousby Woof in the context of what we see later on. So just kind of as a note to try to remember to think about that again. Yeah, good. Tom has an interesting parallel. Tom Hillman, always good for an interesting classical parallel. He says, it's like the difference between the tales of Odysseus wandering and his arrival back in Ithaca. The tales of him wandering are him in Faerie, and the tales in Ithaca are him in this world. Yes, yeah, I mean, the story of him in the hall with the suitors of Penelope versus his adventures with the Cyclopes and Scylla and Charybdis. That's I think an interesting parallel. Again, worth coming back to, especially Tom, since one of the things that we get there, right, in the Odyssey, is, again, the storyteller voice, right? The fact that we hear about almost all of those early voyages from Odysseus' own mouth, right, as storyteller, not as first-hand narration. So that's kind of interesting. Good. Okay, so let's. What I want to focus on, because I still think, even though it is a very different kind of story, I still think that there are a lot of things that we can learn from the story, and in particular, I think it's worth putting a little bit of pressure on the story of Rousby Woof, despite the fact that it does seem different, that it does seem more distant from the narrative, that it's set apart from the other El-ahrairah stories in these ways that we've been discussing. but I don't want to, but it still seems to me to be relevant, indeed even more pressingly relevant than some of the other stories. And we've been looking at the way in which the other stories are kind of connected with the narrative, often sort of indirectly, but that it has had a kind of relevance to the story as it's gone along. The story of Raspy Woof becomes very relevant, right? It becomes woven into the story itself. In fact, it becomes used as a vehicle, right, for the message from El-ahrairah. So it's clear that this story is relevant in a very pressing way to the story as it moves on. So how, why, what else can we see from it? It seems worth looking at a little bit more closely, and it's also a lot of fun. What I want to be thinking of in the context here, then, is to be looking at sort of rabbit culture versus dog culture, right? We get a very this sort of clear lines between rabbits, between El-ahrairah and Rabscuttle, and Raspy Woof clearly on the other side of a pretty major cultural divide, right? So I want to be looking at how, not what directly we're told about rabbit culture in this story, but what the story shows us and how it depicts it about dogs in general, and Raspy Woof in particular, Raspy Woof as representative dog, and what indirectly we can learn about rabbits and rabbit culture from that depiction. Kareta makes a really great initial point where she says it's interesting to see that the story invites us to laugh at a dog when dogs are formally introduced as deadly and scary. It's true. From the first time we almost met a dog or heard of a dog, remember right when they were crossing the N-board on that first morning after they left the Sandalford Warren, dogs are like pretty much like the apex eel. I mean, man, of course, are the apex eel, really, but other than man, there's really nothing bigger and scarier than dogs that can hunt rabbits. They're the top of the line as far as the predators go. So you're right, Karita. It is, I think, interesting and important that they are turned around and made, the objects of ridicule in this story. So let's look at what we learn in this story about the nature of dogs. Here's our first nature of dogs moment here. Sorry, just got to get one thing adjusted here. Okay. All right. Now, Raspy Woof was the man's dog, and he was the most objectionable, malicious, disgusting brute that ever licked a man's hand. He was a big, woolly sort of animal with hair all over his eyes, and the man kept him to guard the vegetable garden, especially at night. Raspy Woof, of course, did not eat vegetables himself, and anyone might have thought that he would be ready to let a few hungry animals have a lettuce or a carrot now and then, and no questions asked. But not a bit of it. Raspy Woof used to run loose from evening till dawn the next day, and not content with keeping men and boys out of the garden, he would go for any animals he found there, rats, rabbits, hares, mice, even moles, and kill them if he could. The moment he smelled anything in the nature of an intruder, he would start barking and kicking up a shine, although very often it was only this foolish noise which warned a rabbit and enabled him to get away in time. Okay, now what do we get here? What's interesting about the way sort of the whole, Raspy Woof as representative of the dog perspective is shown to us here? I think this is one of my favorite passages. Obviously, I chose it, right? Yeah, Arthur says, clearly not told by someone who would recognize the phrase man's best friend. Well, or maybe they would, Arthur, right? That seems to be part of the indictment here, right? Most disgusting brute that ever licked a man's hand. Even notice the assumption, right? The sort of the moral assumption that underlies this description of to use Strawberry's wonderful world animality, right? This sort of solidarity among animals, at least where men are concerned, right? Animal, it might not be, we looked at this, back in book 2, that it's not a natural thing for animals of different kinds to stick together, right? And the, the whole point of the story of the trial of El-ahrairah was sort of pointing out the unusualness of the way that El-ahrairah works with the animals. But so it's not that animals have a natural, but when man is on the other side, I mean, clearly. Right, and notice the almost incomprehension. Here I agree with you there in that sense, Arthur. The almost incomprehension of what on earth is Rousby Woof's motivation. He doesn't eat vegetables. Why does he care if other animals come in the garden? Is it any of his business? Right, and I mean, you'd think he would, let hungry animals, have a carrot now and then, and no questions asked. Not a bit of it, right? What's being described, one would not think, certainly from the human point of view, this is not a vice, this is a virtue, right? Rousby Woof is a good dog. He's a very good dog. He's very loyal and faithful to his human. And that, exactly as Lee says, that he's criticized for loyalty and honor, exactly. And that's a really interesting point, right? So his loyalty, not to say, Sarah, I agree with the significance of your word choice there, his servility to the man is something which will come in for mockery later on, but comes in for not even criticism so much as sort of astonishment here, right? Like, what? Almost incomprehension. What is he doing? Why would he do this? Yeah, good. Philip points out sort of the irony of him focusing on not feeding but killing the other animals, right? Yeah, exactly. The sort of the exact opposite of that sort of solidarity. Yeah, good. And Nick, interesting point. He said, notice that he does keep men and boys away from the garden and not just animals. Yeah, and notice also the tone of that, as if that's expected, as if that's okay, right? Not content with keeping men and boys out of the garden, he would go for any animals he found there too. That's like where the astonishment comes in, right? Okay, like you keep a dog to keep out the other men. All right, well, yeah, I mean, because, men just mess everything up, right? I mean, you let a man loose and he's going to rip up the whole countryside. So yeah, obviously you got to keep men out of your garden, right? That goes without saying. But animals too. Yeah. Tom asks an interesting question. Tom Hillman says, "Isn't this why the dog is the most feared predator and not just his size?" I don't know, because the only times, I think of the times that dogs have actually been spoken about or represented in this story so far, and most of the time it's when they're on their own. Like the dog that they saw by the Enborn was loose, right? And that's when they're really dangerous. The only other instance, I mean, they don't feature strongly in the story up until this point. And the only other instance I can think of an actual depiction of a dog is the dog guardians of El-ahrairah in his trial. They're like the bailiffs, remember, in the trial? So in that sense, Tom, they are, enforcers. They are, they're sort of ferocity in loyalty, as enforcers of the will of, the great. That is a little bit more consistent with what we see here. Yeah, I'm trying to think of other references to dogs. Remember Fiver's disdain for the carrying of the carrots back to the great burrow in Cowslip's burrow when he says they look like dogs, right? Yeah. Now cats, Michael Chaskovsky is contrasting with cats. Yeah, cats are free agents, right? I mean, they're always found in farms, but there is none of that sort of question of loyalty, right? Even the insults that Hazel throws at that cat to get him to chase him, right? He calls him a backdoor saucer scraper, but that's different from, the most disgusting brute that ever licked a man's hand, right? That is to say, like, you get your food handed out to you by men, but not like you are servile to men, because nobody ever really accused a cat of being servile to men. Philip, that's wonderful. Philip Lords calls the dogs the Auslafa of the animal kingdom. Yes, both in the sense of being like the heavies and the enforcers, as well as being a dirty little brute like Hufsa, conceivably. Treacherous to animal kind. There's a sense in which they're sort of traitors. They've gone over to the other side. The one sense in which it does seem that animals as a whole have solidarity is against men. So the fact that the dogs don't just live with men, cats live with men too, but actually serve them, actually are loyal to humans more than they are loyal to other animals, is that's what's sort of appalling. That's what seems to be depicted. Again, it's one of the things I get from this passage, is that sense of betrayal, right? That dogs are not just sort of foolish and maybe a little dumb, but that they're quislings. They're like traitors to animal kind. Well, let's look at the beginning of El-ahrairah and his encounter with Rowsby Woof. But hardly had they crossed the top of the garden and got among the cabbages than Rowsby Woof had winded them, and down he came, barking and yelping, and they were lucky to get out in time. "Dirty little beasts!" shouted Rowsby Woof. How dare you come snouting round here? Get out! Again, Adams is so brilliant at using words to convey the sounds that animals make. It's just so awesome. "Contemptible brute," said El-ahrairah, as they scurried back to the warren with nothing to show for all their trouble. "He's really annoyed me. I don't know yet how it's going to be done, but by frith and inlay, before this frost thaws, we'll eat his cabbages inside the house and make him look a fool into the bargain." Okay. Notice, again, El-ahrairah's reaction. He's really annoyed me. Remember, like, what are the things that have motivated El-ahrairah in the past, right? We've seen him be distressed on behalf of his people. We've seen him react in personal fear, as he did at the beginning when he was trying to tunnel into the hill to avoid Lord Frith and the newly made Elil. At the beginning, we have seen him act in anger and outrage, again, primarily at the danger to his people when the wires were being set on Hufsa's information, or when the rabbits were being forced to live in the marshes of Kelfazin. Here, he is annoyed, right? He's annoyed by the way that Rowsby Woof treats them, right? And he dismisses him as a contemptible brute. Again, not a malicious brute, not a, he was, we've seen him have several different kinds of enemies, not just the Elil in general, but other opponents. But Rowsby Woof is contemptible, and his determination is not only to beat him, right, to eat his cabbages inside the house, right, that is to most, as thoroughly as possible, defeat Rowsby Woof's vigilance, right, but also to make him look a fool into the bargain. Yeah. Carolyn Morehouse says, the description of Rowsby Woof seems to be an Old English sheepdog. I agree, the hair in front of the eyes always made me picture him to be a sheepdog. Carolyn says, they were sheep drovers moving the sheep to market and not really watchdogs. Adam really captures their behavioral traits. They are on average empty-headed these days. Yes, this I can very easily believe this. Yeah, yeah. Um, Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Mark Willey says one of the one of the important things here is the great mystery and contempt for domestication. Animals that are domesticated are no longer animals. Yeah, now Mark, that's mingled with pity, right? With the hutch rabbits. I mean, it's interesting that they do definitely identify the hutch rabbits as animals, and even indeed as potential breeding stock for the warren, as in fact they become. Clover, who bears the first litter, and it's some of Clover's um, uh, kittens who are being raised and trained by Captain Bigwig at the end. But nevertheless, but you're right. There's the impact of man on animals, the way in which animals are rendered unnatural, the way in which men sort of screw up everything, right? There's a way in which, although they've been treated kindly, and certainly although Clover and Haystack and the other hutch rabbits are not complicit with the man, nothing like as complicit as Rousby Woof, of course, they're more victims of the humans than anything else, and the emphasis is on sort of, in a sense, what's been done to them, right? By taking rabbits and making them domesticated, all of their instincts are gone, and they don't know how to take care of themselves, and they're really kind of helpless, and this is all, sort of like a little strange and mysterious to the Watership Down rabbits. Anyway, all of these things are again things that the man has done to them. Has taken rabbits and made them unrabbitly, right? Has made them unnatural. And of course, remember, Woundwort was domesticated briefly too, right? He grew up in the cage of a man, and he was rendered unnatural. He certainly didn't turn out to be particularly natural either, right? Though in a rather different way. Good. Thomas Johnson makes a wonderful point that we should understand El-ahrairah's branding of Rousby Woof as a contemptible brute in the context of Rousby Woof's own accusation of El-ahrairah and Rabscuttle, as Thomas says. By calling the rabbits dirty little beasts, Rousby seems to make a distinction between other animals and himself. He seems to think of himself not only as a servant to humans, but as practically human himself. He views his domestication as a matter of pride. Yes, there is that sense of, there's a line, right? There's a line, but and the line is definitely between animal and human, right? And Rousby Woof, unlike cats don't identify themselves on the other line. They're still animals, right? Dogs, or Rousby Woof anyway, he's on the other side, right? He thinks of himself as on the human side of the line. Not that he imagines himself to be a human exactly, but exactly, Thomas, you said it better than I. That he's affiliated with humans, and therefore, because he's looking across that boundary line at the animals, he's looking down on them. Whereas on the rabbit side of the line, they're looking down on him for being over there, right? And that does seem to be a really important point. One other thing I would come back, sort of in contrast to the two dogs that sort of are the bookends for dogs in this story. That is the dog by the River Enborn at the beginning, and the Nuthanger farm dog at the end. Neither one of them are on the other side of the human-animal line, right? They are owned by humans. They live, but the Nuthanger farm dog is acting like an animal. He's not like Rousby Woof, right? He's not thinking like a human. He's not acting primarily out of loyalty to human and against animals. He is attacking them. He's hunting rabbits and killing rabbits, but only like Elil. Well, not exactly like Elil, more wastefully, right? He doesn't just kill and eat and then go away. He kills a whole bunch just for fun. So in that way, he's more unpredictable and more destructive. But at the same time, again, he's not acting like Rousby Woof. He's not acting from sort of human motivations. Though you're right, Philip, in being more wasteful in his killing, he is being more like man. That's true. But anyway, though, Thomas, you're right that it is interesting that the Nuthanger farm dog doesn't seem to speak, even the hedgerow vernacular. We don't get any indication of any language. The cats can speak with them. We get that, in the same language and the same The same dialect in which they can speak with Kehar. There's no indication that the Nuthanger farm dog understands them. But anyway, he is acting, as Mark Willey says, out of instinct when he chases them, again, like an animal, not like a human being. And I do think that that's an important point, and one thing that makes Rowsby Woof really quite different. Yeah, anyway, okay. More on the nature of dogs. To the fairy wog dog. Okay. "Tricks, Rowsby Woof?" said El-ahrairah. "Ah, I see you do not know me, but how should you? Listen, faithful, skillful hound, I am the fairy wog-dog, messenger of the great dog spirit of the east, Queen Dripslobber. Far, far in the east her palace lies. Ah, Rowsby Woof, if only you could see her mighty state, the wonders of her kingdom, the carrion that lies far and wide upon the sands, the manure, Rowsby Woof, the open sewers. Oh, how you would jump for joy and run nosing all about." Rowsby Woof came up to the fence, and El-ahrairah pushed the rubber nose into the crack and moved it about. Rowsby Woof stood close, sniffing. "Noble rat-catcher," whispered El-ahrairah, "it is indeed I, the fairy wog-dog, sent to honor you." "Oh, fairy wog-dog!" cried Rowsby Woof, dribbling and piddling all over the gravel. "Ah, what elegance! What aristocratic distinction! Can that really be decayed cat that I smell, with the delicate overtone of rotten camel? Ah, the gorgeous East!" "What on earth's camel?" said Bigwig. "I don't know," replied Dandelion, "but it was in the story when I heard it, so I suppose it's some creature or other." Okay. Tom immediately asks, from whom would any rabbit have heard about a camel? Right? Exactly. That camel interlude is really interesting, right? It's fascinating because it gives us a glimpse of sort of the legendary history of this story, right? It was in the story when I heard it, so I suppose it's from some creature or other. This is an error, isn't it, by the way? I think this is a mistake. It's Dandelion who says that as if Dandelion is speaking, but it's not Dandelion who's telling this story. I think that's actually an error in the story. But anyway, but yet it's accurate, right? Where did they get it from? Somebody, somewhere down, we get this glimpse of this story being passed on from generation to generation of rabbit, and that one detail has survived in all of these retellings, the delicate overtone of rotten camel. But of course the association between camel and the gorgeous East is an accurate one, right? Where did that come from? I love the way in which this interjection almost inescapably brings up that question, right? It leads us to ask that question: how do they know about camels? And yet, of course, we're not really given an answer. So the way in which this invites us to sort of think and to speculate about the origin of these rabbit stories. Anyway, yeah. Oh, Nancy, I am misremembering, aren't I? I messed up earlier, didn't I? It's not Bluebell who tells this story? Now I'm getting confused. It is, you're right. It is Dandelion who tells the story. It's me who's making the mistake. Right? Yes, no, you're absolutely right. Yes, no, I was wrong before. Bluebell is the one who's telling this. That was in my mind, because Bluebell is the one telling the story in the burrow, which we're going to get to. We're going to get to that tonight, I promise. Yes, that's right. Okay, thank you. Thank you for clearing up my own mistake and confusion. I was actually thinking about tonight's reading instead of last time. Right, it is Dandelion's story. But remember, I did talk a little bit because I used it in the title for the opening of the story, and the title for the last class, the Big Rabbit, Small Rabbit, and talking about that really unusual rhetorical flourish that we get at the beginning of the story, which really sort of shows Dandelion, as he says he's experimenting. He's never told this before, and he's really wanting to sort of bring it out and give a shot at telling it. Thank you, Nancy, for reminding me of that. Okay, now more. What else do we learn about dogs in this passage, what else do we see? Of course, here's when the mockery begins to come in, right? I love Queen Drip Slobber. That's a marvelous name for the great dog spirit of the East. Exactly, Arthur. The way that dogs glory in disgusting things, as Philip Lord is pointing out, the manure in sewers. Now, I don't know what you think. This seems to me the implication here is, remember, dogs are on the other side, right? The dog is contemptible, mostly because, again, he's crossed the line, right? He's you'd think he'd act like a decent animal would, but no, not a bit of it, right? He acts in this sort of with these inexplicably, human-oriented motivations, right? And that makes him contemptible. But there's a sense in which, by doing that, dogs are just sort of sinking to their natural level, right? That there's something naturally contemptible about dogs anyway, that makes them so prone to be the servile hand lickers of men, and they're glorying in the disgusting things. I mean, the idea of, the gorgeousness of her estate being depicted as, carrion lying far and wide, manure, open sewers. These are the things that El-ahrairah imagines, and of course, rightly, as we learn in the story, are most going to appeal to an excited dog. This is the idea of splendor to a dog, and it just sort of shows how naturally contemptible the dog is. But again, I can't separate that from the kind of initial indictment of Rousby Woof and his affiliation with men. It's the way in which that whole idea of the loyalty of the dog to the human is made to seem consonant, with this sort of fundamentally sort of repulsive nature of, but absurdly, comically repulsive nature. Good. And Josh Evans wants to bring it back to the camel, and I think it's good. He says, does the camel edition give the story a certain authenticity? The story has a truth basis because a dog might have heard of a camel. It does have a kind of a truth basis, right? Especially since, again, we as readers know that it's right? So there is a sense, Josh. In fact, I always felt that to be sort of the strongest impact of the camel interjection, and that is, it's a kind of evidence to us as readers that these stories are legit in some sense, anyway, right? Because although this is something that a rabbit couldn't know, it apparently knows something that we thought they wouldn't have known it, but apparently they do know it. In some sense, right? These particular local rabbits don't really know what camels are, but yeah. So anyway, and Nancy makes an excellent point too. Part of the distinction here is not just between dog and rabbit, but between herbivore and carnivore. Remember Rabscuttle's reaction to the meat that they found that fell off the back of the truck, right? Literally fell off the back of the truck. Meat, disgusting stuff, right? So yeah, the carrion that lies far and wide, I mean, yeah, that's gross, but yeah, Nancy, I mean, all meat is carrion to an herbivore, right? So yeah, I think that's another line, although that's clearly not the whole explanation, right? Because weasels, stoats, foxes, they wouldn't be talked about in this way. They wouldn't, a fox would not be targeted with this story in the same way that a dog is. Good. Karita's also pointing out how prominently the story emphasizes Rousby Woof's vanity and sort of silliness, right? That he believes he is important enough to be honored by a queen and visited by a fairy. The fact that he's so easy to take in this way is part of, like, it's not just that he's contemptible, it's that he is the delightful combination of contemptible and uh, uh, and proud, right? Contemptible and vain, and that's what that really sort of sets him apart. Yeah, good, good. Yeah, and Nick, I agree. Nick Marazzo says it seems that Rousby Woof displays his refinement by detecting both decayed cat and camel. Yes, yes, that there's something slightly sort of boastful in that, right? Um, okay, all right, last one. Then we'll have to regretfully leave Rousby Woof behind. I perceive, honest friend, said El-ahrairah, that you found the meat as swiftly as though it had been a rat. The house is safe and all is well. Now hark. I shall return to the Queen and tell her of all that has passed. It was her gracious purpose that if you showed yourself worthy tonight by trusting her messenger, she would herself send for you and honor you. Tomorrow night she will be passing through this land on her way to the Wolf Festival of the North, and she means to break her journey in order that you may appear before her. Be ready, Rousby Woof. Oh, fairy wogdog, cried Rousby Woof, what joy it will be to grovel and abase myself before the Queen! How humbly shall I roll upon the ground! How utterly shall I make myself her slave! What menial cringing will be mine! I will show myself a true dog. I do not doubt it, said El-ahrairah, and now farewell. Be patient and await my return. Absolutely my favorite line. What menial cringing will be mine. I will show myself a true dog. Just awesome. Yeah, and exactly, Neil, that's a true dog, right? Menial cringing is the essence of doggishness, right? And again, so you see the sort of double-edged satire there, right? The rabbit is proud of being a rabbit, right? El-ahrairah is great and knows that he's great. Remember the whole attitude of El-ahrairah, which led him into trouble in the first story, but which doesn't die at the end of the first story, right? The rabbits remember the promise of Lord Frith, that they will never be destroyed. The rabbits know, they're not the strongest, they're not the best. Well, but they kind of are the best, right? I mean, there's this sense of superiority, this pride in being a rabbit. So that, again, that sort of double-edged satire of, on the one hand, showing the ridiculous, the menial cringing of the dog, what it means to be a true dog, and yet the ridiculous vanity of the dog at the same time, that it's so proud of being what it is, and yet what it is so pathetic and contemptible. Yes. Good. As Carita said, he's vain enough to believe that a queen would go out of her way to honor him, but low enough to grovel and abase himself and be proud of groveling. Yes, exactly. Ethan Pyle says, the fact that it's coming from Rousby Woof himself makes it that much more authentic. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, very good. Yana points out that he finds it adorable that Rousby Woof is, in the end, left to believe it was all true. He never finds out that he's been duped and is proud of what happened. Yeah, Yana, I find that a really fascinating dynamic at the end. Remember the oath, the vow that El-ahrairah swears, as he does indeed swear a vow at the beginning of this story. The vow that he swears is not only to defeat Rousby Woof, but to make him look a fool in the bargain, right? But notice, he does not actually expose Rousby Woof to ridicule. Not publicly or anything, right? His goal is not to shame Rousby Woof, and indeed he doesn't achieve the shaming of Rousby Woof. Rousby Woof, far from being ashamed, chagrined, or publicly humiliated, feels proud of what he did, right? He looks back with fondness on that night his whole life, believing that he accomplished a great thing and had a wonderful honor bestowed upon him. He was unfortunately not able to meet Queen Dripslobber herself, but yet, this great privilege was vouchsafed to him. In Rousby Woof's own experience, he's not been disgraced. He has no idea he's been disgraced, but he has. He has been made a fool of, in the eyes of the rabbits, who apparently are all that matter, right? He's the hero, or the anti-hero of this El-ahrairah story for all time. So rabbits are going to be telling and retelling this story and laughing at Rousby Woof, and so therefore El-ahrairah has succeeded in his vow. But again, you see, it's the sort of lack of spitefulness. Josh, I do think that that's a really important point. There are a lot of stories. I mean, I think, for instance, of a lot of, like medieval fablio, the stories like Chaucer's Miller's Tale, red hot plowshares up the butt kind of stories, where you've got like revenge being taken, like, he did this to us, or like the Miller's Tale, or the Reeves' Tale, even better. He did this to us, so we're going to get back at him, and we're going to do something even worse to him. Very often those stories end up in public ridicule. Like, I'm going to shame him in public. That kind of dynamic is really common, and it sounds like that's sort of the direction that we're going. Where El-ahrairah at the beginning says, "I'm not only going to achieve the end that I want to achieve, namely to get food, in this very, very cold winter, but I'm going to." But I'm going to shame that I'm going to make a fool of the dog. But again, he doesn't do it. He doesn't do it publicly. Or rather, it's only among the rabbits that Rousby Woof is shamed. And there's a sense in which, well, that's all that matters. It doesn't really matter what Rousby Woof thinks of himself, because the fact is, he's what was he? The most objectionable, malicious, disgusting brute that ever licked a man's hand, right? So who cares what he thinks or knows? It's not what matters, right? It is among, sort of the council of animals, and among them, the council of rabbits, that where his reputation sort of really matters. Yeah. Yeah, good. Okay, well, we must move on, but not too far along. Let's move forward, almost into today's reading, with the message of El-ahrairah. Let's look at that moment so soon afterwards, when the story of Rousby Woof becomes the vehicle for the final great prophetic inspiration that Fiver is given. This is, of course, during the siege. Hazel is speaking. "Aren't you working?" he asked listlessly to Fiver. Remember, he's listless. This is right in the moment when Hazel is beginning to feel despair. He feels, on the one hand, almost angry, right? This is not the proper end to the clever track that they had run, right? It shouldn't end like this. But also despair. There's nothing they can do. He believes that they're all going to die, and he's feeling guilty for leading them, leading them along the path which led them here, in the end. And there is, of course, a sense in which Hazel, I think, is not being too hard on himself. He's quite right about that. Remember, Holly warned him, right? It was Hazel's idea. It was Hazel's insistence to say, no, let's go and raid Ephrafa and steal the does out of there. Now, again, I'm not saying it was a wrong idea, but it was very much Hazel's idea to bring the wrath of Ephrafa down upon them, whereas Holly was telling them, look, it's going to be bad if we do, right? So again, Hazel's guilt about what's happening there is certainly not something that he's just, I don't think it's inappropriate, and he's really kind of at the bottom of that here. "No," replied Fiver. "I'm listening." "To the digging, you mean?" "No, not the digging. There's something I'm trying to hear, something the others can't hear. Only I can't hear it either, but it's close. Deep. Leaf drip deep. Leaf drift deep. I'm going away, Hazel. Going away." His voice grew slow and drowsy. "Falling. But it's cold. Cold." The air in the dark burrow was stifling. Hazel bent over Fiver, pushing the limp body with his nose. "Cold," muttered Fiver. How cold." There was a long silence. "Fiver," said Hazel. "Fiver, can you hear me?" Suddenly a terrible sound broke from Fiver, a sound at which every rabbit in the warren leaped in dreadful fear, a sound that no rabbit had ever made, that no rabbit had the power to make. It was deep and utterly unnatural. The rabbits working on the far side of the wall crouched terrified. One of the does began to squeal. "Dirty little beasts!" yelped Fiver. How dare you! Get out, 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 out!" And it's very clear that Fiver is not just quoting. Fiver is actually barking. The sound of a dog's barking emerges from Fiver in this moment. And it's equally clear, I think, in the context that the first time he says it, how cold, he's transitioning into that, right? That's still Fiver's voice, right? We can see him falling, right? He's falling into that. He's sort of losing himself, and it's the first stage of the sort of transmission of the message that's coming through, but it's still within his own voice, and then it completely transforms him, and he makes this sound that no rabbit had the power to make. But of course, the message from El-ahrairah is two-parted, right? Fiver hears it, and Fiver is the transmitter of it. And we've looked at other points in which Fiver's sort of prophetic awareness comes upon him. He'll say things and not remember saying them afterwards, right? We saw him when he was pursuing Hazel, after Hazel was shot, being more deliberate, right? Him sort of seeking to try to pursue the bloody rabbit that he saw in his vision through his dreams. We saw him sort of enter consciously into his dreams in that conversation he was having with the man by the message board back by the Sandalford Warren. Karita, you're right. He seems to be more at the mercy of his visions in this moment. Absolutely. Absolutely, I think he is. Karita says that she started to feel sorry for Fiver in this moment as she hadn't done before. I think that there is a change here. We'll come back to that. Look at how this is discussed afterwards. But yeah, Fiver is something is happening to him which hasn't happened before, and I think that the bark emerging from him really sort of shows how utterly unnatural this is. Right? That those words are used to describe the sound. Right? It was deep and utterly unnatural. But also, what is happening to Fiver is utterly unnatural here. This goes beyond. Remember, like the el-ahrairah talking about how, like, yeah, there are some rabbits who have that kind of vision. Like, it's been known. The el-ahrairah believes that it exists. This goes way beyond, being, what was the phrase he used? An intuitive rabbit, right? That's a phrase that was used before. Fiver's not just being intuitive. Right, he's not even being a direct transmitter. He's being overridden in some way here. Right, his very rabbitry is being overridden here, and there does seem to be something more violent in that sense, I think, being done to Fiver in this moment than we've seen before. And as Philip points out, it nearly kills him. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, we'll come back to that too. But again, as I said, this is only half of the intervention by El-ahrairah, right? Half is the message that Fiver speaks. The second is Hazel's reception of it. Shuddering, Hazel clawed at Fiver's side. "Wake, Fiver, wake!" But Fiver was lying in a deep stupor. In Hazel's mind, green branches were straining in the wind. Up and down they swayed, thresh and ply. There was something he could glimpse between them. What was it? Water, he sensed, and fear. Then suddenly he saw clearly for an instant a little huddle of rabbits on the bank of a stream at dawn, listening to the sound of yelping in the wood above and the scolding of a jay. "If I were you, I shouldn't wait until nightfall. I should go now. In fact, I think you'll have to. There's a large dog loose in the wood. There's a large dog loose in the wood." The wind blew. The trees shook their myriads of leaves. The stream was gone. He was in the honeycomb, facing Bigwig in the dark, across the motionless body of Fiver. The scratching from above was louder and closer. the insight that Hazel is given into what the message means, right? And it's interesting to me that not only is this, and as we were talking about sort of the most complete sort of surrender of Fiverr to this message, the most, the greatest violence that's been done to Fiverr by those things from that other world. Remember the language that Fiverr was using to describe them in that one passage we looked at. It's also his least intelligible message, right? Nobody else in the Warren has the faintest idea what's going on, right? Not only do they not get the message, right? Not only are they not inspired with it, not only is Hazel the only rabbit in earshot of the unnatural barking emerging from Fiverr, not only is he the only rabbit who is inspired with the plan of how to save the Warren, nobody else it doesn't even register as a message, right? Everyone else is just absolutely terrified, right? Like Fiverr has just gone mad in some absolutely appalling new way, right? At a really inconvenient time. That's all anybody else can see or hear. So again, it's not even just like Fiverr said something cryptic that nobody else understands, right? That's kind of happened before, right? But here, it's much more than that. Now, the very mode of his speaking is the thing which puts his utterance sort of outside of the comprehension. It's not even like a candidate for comprehension, right? No one even understands that but Hazel gets it, right? And it's clear that that's an intervention too. The vision that Hazel gets of them on the Endborn, the way in which his memory of that first morning away from Sandalford is made applicable to this moment in his mind. It's clear that that's every bit as supernatural a moment of inspiration as Fiverr's own barked message. Now, what about Rousby Woof, though? It's not just a dog's bark, right? It's Rousby Woof barking, right? He's quoting Dandelion's story. And we see he's quoting it even before he slips completely into the vision. The how cold. At first it sounds like he's stammering, right? He's already kind of, his speech had become fragmentary already before that point. So even though it was only, it was like 25 pages ago, we still might not remember. We might, when he's saying how cold, we might not be thinking of Rousby Woof right away. Maybe we are. The how is very close. But anyway, then the direct quotation, the Dirty Little Beasts quotation, brings us directly there. So thinking of all the things that we saw in the story of Rousby Woof, why, how is it being applied? Why that story? Why that story? Why that quotation from that story? Michael Jaskowski points to an interesting kind of paradox, that now that all the rabbits believe Fiverr and his visions and messages become less comprehensible. Good. Well, Thomas Johnson points out one clear common ground between them, between the situation in Watership Down and the story of Rousby Woof, that both are examples of rabbits manipulating dogs. And clearly that's what Hazel needs to save Watership Down. Good. Nancy Fosberg points another obvious similarity is the protection of their territory. That's really interesting. Certainly that's how it's received by the Ephrathins up above, right? And the ones who are guarding the runs, who are like, there's some animal down there, right? And we're trespassing on that animal's ground, right? We're likely to be attacked if we go in by whatever that was that made that sound, which is not a rabbit. Good. And Thomas Johnson points out how the Dirty Little Beasts thing is also sort of a very Ephrathine sentiment. Yeah, the antisocial little beasts, right? Yeah, exactly. The kind of disdain for those that are smaller and weaker, for those that they see to be beneath them, that is a bit of an Ephraim trait, right? Certainly a Woundwortian trait. Yeah, yeah. I like the way in which sort of Fiver quoting Rousby Woof there seems to me to work in a couple different ways, right? And it's interesting that Thomas and Nancy were both thinking about it kind of from different angles there, and I think that both of them work. That is, on the one hand, because there are kind of two audiences for Fiver's utterance, right? The primary audience, of course, is Hazel, and by accident, all the rest of the rabbits in Watership Down. But the point of the utterance is not to frighten them. The point of the utterance is to communicate to Hazel. So a message like, think along the lines of manipulating dogs, right, Thomas, as you were suggesting, is one thing, and this triggers, again, in what does not seem to be a natural flow of ideas, Hazel's own thoughts. But of course, there's another audience, which is the Ephraim's, who are guarding, and indeed the overhearing of the sound of this mysterious animal within the warren is one of the things which contributes to the overall fear, this sort of growing, nearly, sort of mythic terror that is beginning to grow within the hearts of the Ephraim's towards the Watership Down rabbits. Yeah, good. So I also love, well, that's a little irrelevant. Yeah, anyway, so and again, they're also the audience. So in as much as Fiver is sort of speaking in the place of Rousby Woof, it's like, Nancy, as you say, guarding territory, right? It's a warning. And a contemptuous warning to those who would seek to invade. But it also, of course, within the context of that warning, who just heard the story of Rousby Woof, they're not going to hear, in as much as they're able to retain their senses after hearing a direct quotation of Rousby Woof, in Rousby Woof's own language, as it were. It's also an excellent reminder of the triumph of El-ahrairah, right? There's, I think, the fact that an El-ahrairah story, and indeed one fresh in everybody's minds, is evoked here is, of course, another one of those sort of reminders, right, of the promise of Frith that the rabbits will never be destroyed. Yeah, good. I want to, of course, I'm determined to go on and talk about Woundwort and Bigwig's confrontation tonight. That is going to happen no matter what else we do or don't get to. But I wanted to sort of finish out looking at the story of Fiver, because we're going to need to get back to that, and I don't want to just totally leave it behind. So let's look at two other passages more briefly. I'm going to be totally efficient here. This was always one of my favorite passages. Vervain advanced slowly across the floor. Even he could derive little satisfaction from the prospect of killing a Tharn rabbit half his own size in obedience to a contemptuous taunt. The small rabbit made no move whatever, either to retreat or to defend himself, but only stared at him from great eyes which, though troubled, were certainly not those of a beaten enemy or a victim. Before his gaze, Vervain stopped in uncertainty, and for long moments the two faced each other in the dim light. Then, very quietly, and with no trace of fear, the strange rabbit said, "I'm sorry for you with all my heart, but you cannot blame us, for you came to kill us if you could." "Blame you?" answered Vervain. "Blame you for what?" "For your death. Believe me, I am sorry for your death." Vervain in his time had encountered any number of prisoners who, before they died, had cursed or threatened him, not uncommonly with supernatural vengeance, much as Bigwig had cursed Woundwort in the storm. If such things had been liable to have any effect on him, he would not have been the head of the Auslöffe. Indeed, for almost any utterance that a rabbit in this dreadful situation could find to make, Vervain was unthinkingly ready with one or other of a stock of jeering rejoinders. Now, as he continued to meet the eyes of this unaccountable enemy, the only one he had faced in all the long night's search for bloodshed, horror came upon him, and he was filled with a sudden fear of his words, gentle and inexorable as a falling of bitter snow in a land without refuge. The shadowy recesses of the strange burrow seemed full of whispering, malignant ghosts, and he recognized the forgotten voices of rabbits done to death months since in the ditches of Ephrathah. "Let me alone!" cried Vervain. "Let me go! Let me go!" This is such a cool moment. First, Karita, as you say, Fiver's pity on his enemies, right? His genuine pity. He is speaking with prophetic authority, and it's a prophetic authority that Vervain recognizes. Vervain can hear, right, the truth in his words that Vervain is going to die, right? But the fact that it's delivered with this genuine pity, right, makes it even more moving, right? But notice, there is clearly a supernatural element here, right? Supernatural vengeance is referred to, right? Rabbits promising supernatural vengeance. You know, Frith sees you. Remember, that's the curse that the narrator is recalling here, right? He calls on Frith to smite Woundwort and his Asla full of bullies. That's how rabbits always talk, right? When they're being threatened and tortured by Vervain, the most loathed officer in all of Ephrathah. And really, I mean, of course, Woundwort is the head of everything in Ephrathah, but Vervain is really kind of the poster child for, like, the twisted thing that the Ausla in general and sort of, rabbits in Ephrathah have been made into under the influence of Woundwort. But what we see is Fiver doesn't, threaten him with supernatural vengeance. He just does it, right? He hears whispering, malignant ghosts. He recognizes the forgotten voices of rabbits done to death months since. He can hear the voices of his victims whispering all around him, right? And he's terrified and overwhelmed by this. Now, this could be just a purely psychological phenomenon, right? Vervain is not a good guy, and he's done all these horrible things, and he's probably, subconsciously guilty about that. So in this moment, he is, when he's confronted with the prospect of his mortality, and hears this strange rabbit speaking with such conviction about his imminent death, his guilty conscience overwhelms him. That, that's a very sustainable reading. But I don't think so. I think in my reading, there's something genuinely supernatural happening. And what I come back to is Fiver's own words. That they that he talks about, the they who live in that other world that he has some kind of access to or some kind of encounter with, right? To the point where, in that conversation with Hazel at the foot of the down, when Hazel was recovering, he's not always sure whether he's really here or whether he's there, right? Remember the way that he talked about Silverweed, right? That they had gotten him Silverweed, right? They don't give their secrets up for nothing. They had spoken to and spoken through Silverweed, and they had in some sense claimed Silverweed, and Fiver said, I'm sure he stopped running, right? There's that sort of spiritual they, right? And that Fiver speaks of, and I don't see any reason to doubt that Fiver knows what he's talking about when he talks about them. And what has just happened to Fiver is him being submerged in that other place, being taken to that other place, more thoroughly, so thoroughly that his spirit leaves his body behind, it seems, such that he is taken for dead by everybody, by his friends and enemies alike. Remember the reference at the very end of the story to Hazel leaving his body behind. Doesn't it kind of sound like that's almost what Fiver did, right? That his spirit went away and left his body behind. So the idea that when Fiver returns, his spirit returns to his body, maybe he's not alone, doesn't seem to me at all unlikely in the context. Carolyn says the sound that he had made was not a sound that a power had the rabbit to make, and now Fiver seems to be almost calling up the ghosts. Though again he's not summoning them, right? He's just they just are with him, right? They're there. It's like he returns in their company, like they haven't even really left him. Remember how sort of like distracted Fiver is from now on after this? Like he's now even less in this world than he used to be. Carita says, Vervain's, the thing that strikes her is Vervain's cry, right? That it doesn't sound like it's just a psychological thing. It's not just like, I'm sorry for the terrible, but let me go. He seems to be addressing the ghosts. He's addressing the spirits, not Fiver. Good. Last Fiver passage. Since the night of the siege, Fiver had spent much time alone, and even in the honeycomb or at morning and evening sylphlay, was often silent and preoccupied. No one resented this. He looks right through you in such a nice friendly way, as Bluebell put it. For each in his own manner recognized that Fiver was now more than ever governed, whether he would or no, by the pulse of that mysterious world of which he had once spoken to Hazel during the late June days they had spent together at the foot of the down. It was Bigwig who said, one evening when Fiver was absent from the honeycomb at story time, that Fiver was one who had paid more dearly than even himself for the night's victory over the Ephraphans. Yet to his doe, Vilthoril, Fiver was devotedly attached, while she had come to understand him almost as deeply as Hazel ever had. That sense that he has paid a price. Arthur Harrow can't help but remember Frodo after returning to the Shire. It's not quite the same, Arthur. I mean, obviously it's not exactly the same. Big surprise there. But what I mean, other than the obvious ways in which it's different, is Frodo was wounded and his wounds couldn't fully heal, right? Fiver's not exactly been wounded, but Arthur, I still do think the parallel is an interesting one, because what seems to connect the two, to me, is both of them have made a sacrifice. Both of them have put themselves sort of in harm's way. Both of them have lost their own lives, their own peace, in order to do something that nobody else could do, in order to save everybody else. It's this passage more than anything else that makes me see, in retrospect, that moment of Fiver, that moment of Fiver's really as an act of sacrifice, because remember, sort of going back for a minute to the beginning of that scene when Hazel and Fiver are talking, it's something that comes over him, but it's not just something that overwhelms him immediately, right? There is that element of, he's trying to hear, but it's close, deep, leaf drift deep. I'm going away, Hazel, going away. That statement, I'm going away, on the one hand sounds like something is happening to me, right? But at the same time sounds like goodbye. I'm leaving. I'm going in search of that thing that is close but that I can't quite hear. I can tell that there's a message here that should be delivered, but I have to go after it. And he does so at a cost. So, I mean, I do think that we have a moment of that this is a real sacrifice for Fiver, and that he is genuinely damaged as a consequence of it. But it is nice, Karita, that he does get a mostly happy ending. He does get a mate and lives happily, right? So in that way, it is very unlike Frodo. One brief footnote on Fiver's mate. Notice who gets a mate. There aren't enough does to go around initially, right? So I mean, even after they come back from Ephrafa, the bucks outnumber the does in the warren. Fiver, however, is one of the ones that gets a mate. In fact, he's one of the few. He's one, and his mate is one of the first to have a litter, right? So it's almost like Fiver is almost like deferred to, right? Remember, we were talking about how natural everybody was assuming, like naturally we're gonna fight when it comes mating time, right? When the does are ready for mutter, as Kehara would say, is all for fight, right? I'm going to go out on a limb and say Fiver probably didn't kick anybody's butt in order to get Vilthrill, right? I mean, probably didn't face down Silver, and knock the stuffing out of him in order to get his mate. But again, it just sort of shows. I think it's a very, very subtle but really neat testimony to the different values of the Watership Down Warren. Tom Owen says he just stared into his soul. Yes, you're going to look Fiver in the eye and say, that you're going to take his dough. Yeah, exactly. Also, sub note, who's Heisenflay's mate? Heisenflay is heavily pregnant at the time of the attack. Who's the father? Who's Heisenflay's mate? It never says. Does it ever say? I don't think it ever says. Did I miss it? Ed, me too. Ed and I both guess that Bigwig is the father. I'm thinking so too. Ed, the reason I really like that reading is it seems to me a beautiful way to sort of show the way in which it's such an elegant reversal of that moment when Bigwig summons her down to his burrow as an Ephraim officer, right, for mating. The way that they meet is in that pretext of that, that horrible Ephraim violation of rabbit habits. Remember how close to the doe's heart it was, that ability to choose their own mates, right? And but of course, we know that it's only a pretense, and the way that Heisenflay was so supportive to Bigwig and the way that he relied upon her, the really sort of adorable and heartwarming moments, the pictures that we get of her, the two of them, huddling together for comfort and warmth in Ephrafa, as co-conspirators. I too, we're never told, but I kind of hope that it's Bigwig. But Nancy, I think your point is an excellent one too. That Nancy says she kind of likes that Heisenflay's mate is her own business after the way that choice was taken away in Ephrafa. It is a really wonderful kind of statement of, see, yeah, in Watership Down the does are free to choose their own mates, right? In fact, we're not even informed. We're on a need-to-know basis about that. Yeah, good, as Chris Swank says. She is a singular doe. She's not just some buck's mutter, right? Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I do really like that element of it too. Okay, but let's get to General Woundwort and Bigwig and the passage that makes me cry every time I read this book. Okay. General Woundwort. When it came to fighting, Woundwort was not given to careful calculation. Men and larger animals, such as wolves, usually have an idea of their own numbers and those of the enemy, and this affects their readiness to fight and how they go about it. Woundwort had never had any need to think like this. What he had learned from all his experience of fighting was that nearly always there are those who want to fight and those who do not, but feel they cannot avoid it. More than once he had fought alone and imposed his will on crowds of other rabbits. He held down a great warren with the help of a handful of devoted officers. It did not occur to him now, and if it had, he would not have thought it mattered, that most of his rabbits were still outside, that those who were with him were fewer than those on the other side of the wall, and that until Groundsel had got the runs open, they could not get out even if they wanted to. This sort of thing does not count among fighting rabbits. Ferocity and aggression are everything. What Woundwort knew was that those beyond the wall were afraid of him, and that on this account he had the advantage. This glimpse into the again, this is another great moment of Adams kind of reminding us, right? Reminding us of, don't forget, rabbit perspective. Don't start thinking about this like humans, right? Don't project upon Woundwort the same kind of calculation, the same kind of attitude that a human being might have under the circumstances. And not because humans are smart and rabbits are dumb, but because their outlooks are so very different. All that matters is the attitude, right? He knows. And also with Woundwort, notice, it's not just that he's bigger and stronger. It doesn't say many times he had imposed his will upon crowds of others because he was the biggest rabbit around and nobody could possibly compete with him. That's true, of course. He is the biggest rabbit around. But a crowd of rabbits could, right? Remember, his plan for fighting the massive unknown chief rabbit of this warren is that they're going to take him and they're going to pull him down from all sides, right? Even a big, strong rabbit could be set upon and killed by many rabbits at once. It's not his physical attributes that give Woundwort his advantage. It's his attitude. It's his fearlessness and his desire to fight. There are those who want to fight and those that don't, but feel they can't avoid it. He wants to fight and to impose his will upon others, and therein lies his advantage. And we have the beginning of their confrontation, and I love, here's Bluebell telling his story that I was referring to earlier, I love the interlacing of these things. It's so fantastic. Again, if we, if ever we were having problems with sort of seeing how the stories of El-ahrairah apply, this one's pretty clear. So then El-ahrairah said to the fox, "Fox you may smell, and fox you may be, but I can tell your fortune in the water." Suddenly Woundwort spoke. "Flaily," he said, "why do you want to throw your life away? I can send one fresh rabbit after another into this run if I choose. You're too good to be killed. Come back to Ephrathah. I promise I'll give you the command of any mark you like. I'll give you my word." "Silflay hraka, you and blear hair," replied Bigwig, which I am not going to translate. "Aha," said the fox, "tell my fortune, eh? And what do you see in the water, my friend? Fat rabbits running through the grass? Yes, yes?" "Very well," said Woundwort, "but remember, Thlaly, you yourself can stop this nonsense whenever you wish." "No," replied El-ahrairah, "it is not fat rabbits that I see in the water, but swift hounds on the scent, and my enemy flying for his life." This, of course, appears to be one of the stories that was requested back when Bigwig overrode the committee and insisted upon the story of the Black Rabbit of Inlay. Somebody requested El-ahrairah and the Fox in the Water, which seems to be the story that Bluebell is telling here in the background. Again, the juxtaposition is delightful. It shows, Bigwig is thinking, it's a great idea for him to tell a story, right? Distract them and keep them calm. He's not explicitly thinking of the application of that story to himself. But of course, it has a delightful meaning, of course, which none of the rabbits can possibly know. It's like we're getting a final message from El-ahrairah here, because of course it is swift hounds on the scent and my enemy flying for, well, not so much the enemy flying for his life, not Woundwort himself, though the rest of them perhaps. The sort of foretelling implicit in that is pretty compelling. But of course, Woundwort is deceiving Bigwig. He doesn't mean this, and Bigwig knows he doesn't mean this. But it's just as El-ahrairah is tricking the fox, right? And the fox is speaking so confidently. We can see, the truth is being revealed to us here through the El-ahrairah story in the background. This is the turning point, the crucial moment in their fight. Really, the climax of their fight. Suddenly, Woundwort leaped forward in a single bound and landed full against Bigwig like a branch falling from a tree. He made no attempt to use his claws. His great weight was pushing, chest to chest, against Bigwig's. With heads side by side, they bit and snapped at each other's shoulders. Bigwig felt himself sliding slowly backward. He could not resist the tremendous pressure. His back legs, with claws extended, furrowed the floor of the run as he gave ground. In a few moments he would be pushed bodily into the burrow behind. Putting his last strength into the effort to remain where he was, he loosed his teeth from Woundwort's shoulder and dropped his head, like a cart horse straining at a load. Still he was slipping. Then, very gradually it seemed, the terrible pressure began to slacken. His claws had a hold of the ground. Woundwort, teeth sunk in his back, was snuffling and choking. Though Bigwig did not know it, his earlier blows had torn Woundwort across the nose. His nostrils were full of his own blood, and with jaws closed in Bigwig's fur he could not draw his breath. A moment more and he let go his hold. Bigwig, utterly exhausted, lay where he was. And yes, Carita, Providence intervenes again, right? Yes, exactly. We can see yet another example out of so many of how everything is orchestrated in just such a way to make things work out well for the rabbits of Watership Down, and not so well for General Woundwort. This fundamental image of the two of them pushing, the fact that Bigwig's... we talked before about Bigwig being a kind of, not anti-Woundwort, but parallel to Woundwort, or Woundwort being a kind of a foil for Bigwig. How there's this similarity, strong similarity between the two of them, their aggression, their desire to fight. That description in the previous passage fits for both of them, right? Bigwig likes to fight. Remember, there's that moment when Hazel feels a wry envy for Bigwig, right? That Bigwig is actually looking forward to the fight when the Ephrathins break in. The two of them are like, right? And yet the two of them are pushing in diametrically opposed directions. And more importantly, although the two of them are both equally willing to fight, the physical imagery here in this passage, this moment as the climax of their fight really shows the difference between what the two of them are about, right? The two of them are alike. They're so close in so many ways, and yet very different. And the difference is, the one is the invader, right? Forcing his will upon these other rabbits, breaking into their warren, trying to push through into, sort of this inner sanctuary where the newborn kittens, the hope of the future of the warren, are lying. This, and there's Bigwig just standing his ground, right, trying only to stop him. And again, even the image of Bigwig releasing the grip of his claws, right? The two of them are biting at his teeth, I mean. The two of them are biting at each other's shoulders, but it's Bigwig who lets go. He sort of stops attacking, stops trying to hurt Woundwort at all, simply to stop him, right? I must prevent him from coming in and harming Bigwig, putting himself merely as an obstacle between Woundwort and the rest of his warren. Yeah, it's just so marvelously evocative of, although their attitudes are similar in so many ways, the fundamentally different values that the two of them have. And it's pretty clear which set of values kind of gets El-ahrairah's approval here. Um, uh, yeah, yeah, good. Um, and Kurita, yeah, isn't it interesting that Woundwort hangs on till he can't breathe anymore, right? So we have him refusing to let go, like Bigwig. Maybe had Woundwort let go and pushed, right, and put his head down like Bigwig, he could have won, right? But he won't release his grip until he's forced to, until his savage, um, uh, sinking his teeth into the shoulder of his victim almost suffocates him, right? And again, that too seems sort of evocative of Woundwort's overall attitude. Then, my favorite passage. Once more he climbed on the earth as a Woundwort again. He climbed on the earth pile. Then he stopped. Vervain and Thistle, raising their heads to peer past him from behind, saw why. Flaily had made his way up the run, and was crouching immediately below. Blood had matted the great thatch of fur on his head, and one ear, half severed, hung down beside his face. His breathing was slow and heavy. "You'll find it much harder to push me back from here, General," he said. With a sort of weary, dull surprise, Woundwort realized that he was afraid. He did not want to attack Flaily again. He knew, with flinching certainty, that he was not up to it. But who was, he thought? Who could do it? No, they would have to get in by some other way, and everyone would know why. "Flaily," he said, "we've unblocked a run out here. I can bring in enough rabbits to pull down this wall in 4 places. Why don't you come out?" Flaily's reply, when it came, was low and gasping, but perfectly clear. "My chief rabbit has told me to defend this run, and until he says otherwise, I shall stay here." "His chief rabbit?" said Vervain, staring. It had never occurred to Woundwort, or any of his officers, that Flaily was not the chief rabbit of his warren. Yet what he said carried immediate conviction. He was speaking the truth. And if he was not the chief rabbit, then somewhere close by there must be another, stronger rabbit who was. A stronger rabbit than Flaily. Where was he? What was he doing at this moment? Woundwort became aware that Thistle was no longer behind him. Yeah, you cannot pass, Yana, exactly. That's the line, as you probably noticed. My chief rabbit has told me to defend this run, and until he says otherwise, I shall stay here, is the line that brings me to tears every time I read this book. Bigwig wins. How does Bigwig beat Woundwort? Not physically, right? I mean, yes, Bigwig is big and strong. That's why he's able to, that's why Woundwort doesn't kill him right away. But remember that passage at the, that we were just looking at the beginning there. It's not about physical, right? It's not. What it's about is about the will to fight. It's about the attitude. And Woundwort is finally overcome, is finally surpassed, again, not just physically, but in his attitude. What he realized, he does not want to attack Flaily again. Woundwort, for the first time in his life, finds himself not one who wants to fight, but one who doesn't want to fight but feels that he has to, right? That's exactly the situation that Woundwort is now in for the first time ever. And why is it? What is it that enables Bigwig to overcome Woundwort in this way? Again, it's what he's doing and why he's doing it, right? It's the fact that he is doing this in obedience and sacrifice. His chief rabbit has told him to guard this run, and he's going to do that no matter what, right? This is not about, the reason Bigwig's will is stronger is that it's not just his will, right? It's his will on behalf of his warren, on behalf of his friends, on behalf of his chief rabbit, who has so thoroughly earned his Bigwig's own loyalty and respect. And that is something that Woundwort fundamentally can't understand. The marvelous, delicious irony of the fact that Woundwort, his imagination is running wild with the idea of the great, horrible, mysterious Chief Rabbit that must be of this warren. Of course, the marvelous irony that he's already met the Chief Rabbit of this warren and dismissed him out of hand, right? Absolutely assumed that he was completely worthless, right? Again, just sort of shows that fundamentally the difference between Bigwig and Woundwort. Where is it that they're different? They're different where it really matters, and that is the fundamental difference between them. For Woundwort, it's all about himself, right? Remember, we were looking at him last week for a long time. It's all about extending his own power, right? That's his fundamental thing, that he wants to have power over others. Bigwig, from right near the beginning, remember, that's the big crisis at the beginning. Who's going to be Chief Rabbit? Is it going to be Hazel or is it going to be Bigwig? Now we see in the end, thinking about Hazel's language, now we see the end of the track that Bigwig has run, right? He could have asserted himself to be Chief Rabbit. But if he had, he would only have been a kind of a mini Woundwort, and I don't think he could have defeated Woundwort here. Instead, he submitted, right? He acknowledged and respected Hazel, even though Hazel could not possibly fight him, especially once Hazel is well, not crippled, but lamed, right? It's exactly. As Karita points out, Woundwort considered Hazel not even worth killing. Good. Alyssa says that's what she likes about the symbolism of his dropping his head in the previous passage. Yeah, there's that gesture of humility, Alyssa, right? He's going to put his head down, right? It's not about him. The way that Bigwig, abases himself there, right? And we see him just sort of, giving everything that he has for others. Yeah, that does work in that way symbolically very, very well. All right, one last passage, and then I'll let you go. Sort of the last follow-up to this. I want to sort of end. We'll have one more thing one more Woundwort passage to talk about next time. This is, of course, when the dog shows up. "Run!" cried Campion, stamping. "Run for your lives!" He raced through them and was gone over the down. Not knowing what he meant or where to run, they turned one way and another. 5 bolted down the opened run, and a few more into the wood. But almost before they had begun to scatter, into their midst bounded a great black dog, snapping, biting, chasing hither and thither like a fox in a chicken run. Woundwort alone stood his ground. As the rest fled in all directions, he remained where he was, bristling and snarling, bloody-fanged and bloody-clawed. The dog, coming suddenly upon him, face to face among the rough tussocks, recoiled a moment, startled and confused. Then it sprang forward, and even as they ran, his Owsla could hear the general's raging, squealing cry, "Come back, you fools! Dogs aren't dangerous! Come back and fight!" Come back and fight! The last words of General Woundwort, at least the last recorded words of General Woundwort. Michael says it's interesting that he challenges the dog but gives up against Bigwig. This time reading the book, I was really struck in a way I've never been struck before by that choice of phrase that I highlighted in my subtitle, "Woundwort alone stood his ground." That's, of course, the chapter title. A couple of chapters ago, Bigwig stands his ground, right? And we have that now flipped. And the way, I find it fascinating, the way that Adams handles Woundwort here at the end. So fascinating because he pulls back from simply letting Woundwort become a kind of caricature, right? From letting him become a kind of allegorical embodiment of everything that is, evil in rabbit kind. It works both ways, right? On the one hand, Woundwort standing his ground against the dog is sort of the final and utter expression of his madness, right? There's something almost absurd about it. No rabbit could possibly defeat a dog. I mean, just size proportion, not a lab anyway. Woundwort could probably take my dog actually, but I've got a little 15-pound dog. But not a lab, I don't think. And if I'm recalling correctly, it is a black lab, the dog from Nuthanger Farm. But anyway, so again, it seems like on the one hand, like the final expression of his madness, the final, there's an element. I've just been reading. It's January, so I've just been rereading the Silmarillion, and I just read this morning a passage that made me think of this. I was thinking, Woundwort attacking. I was reminded of Woundwort attacking the dog when I got to the passage about the death of Ungoliant in the Silmarillion. Ungoliant finally, in her uttermost famine, at last devoured herself, and there's a sense in which that's happening to Woundwort here, right? The final expression of this. Again, thinking of Hazel's words, the final end of the track that he has run. This is the end of the track that he has run, right? To go further and further into this delusion, right? Of that rabbits can in fact, stand up to and overcome any evil. No, not dogs. Actually, turns they are dangerous. Actually. Right, but at the same time, there's another side to this, right? The fact is, we're told that he does drive the dog off, right? The dog is wounded, both scratched very seriously on the nose and bit. He's limping. The dog is when he comes back home. Woundwort does, in fact, succeed to a pretty remarkable extent to fight the dog. And and what's more, the narrator goes out of his way to point out that if it hadn't been for Woundwort, then more of the Ephrathins would have died that day. So I mean, it was after its tussle with Woundwort, the dog lost interest, right? Tracked down that one wounded rabbit and killed it, but didn't seem that keen on going after rabbits much more that day, right? So Woundwort standing his ground against the it's like, well, by golly, right? In his last moment, the other way of looking at Woundwort's last moment is a moment of self-sacrifice, standing up in defense of his people. Kind of like Bigwig standing his ground against Woundwort himself, right? So, it's not like that's not the whole story, and it's not, again, it's it's not like, oh, and he died a saint, right? Clearly, but that element is there too, right? He died achieving some good end, in fact, as it happens, and I think that's really fascinating. We'll look a little bit more at Woundwort's end and his final legend next time. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't end with Woundwort in complete ignominy, right? We don't end up with like the tearing down and the ridicule of Woundwort. There is a sense in which he dies almost a hero, something like a hero, anyway. Okay. Well, that's about as far as I was guessing I was going to get today. I still have two things that I want to talk about Book 4, which we'll do at the beginning of class next time. I want to look at the, one other theme that we've been tracking, well, sort of two other themes that we've talked about before, and which really come up prominently here at the end. And one I want to bring to a close our conclusion of sort of this question of the natural versus the unnatural. This language that keeps coming up in the story. What's natural for rabbits and what's unnatural for rabbits, and look at how that's treated here at the end in this final crisis, because I think we can see some really interesting things. So I want to look at that on the one hand. At the same time, or no, not the same time, right after that, I want to look at the way that this, dreams and legends springing forth out of the grass. I want to look at legends, and we've sort of talked about that, the kind of mythic stature that, remember Hazel's return to the warren after he was shot, right? And the kind of mythic stature that Hazel has begun to have for the other rabbits in the warren. I want to come back to that here at the end, and of course looking through to the epilogue and the final encounter with El-ahrairah there at the end. So those are the two topics I want to hit on. I also want to answer your questions and talk about other things that you guys want to talk about. So if you would go ahead and send me and email me your questions. Between now and next week, we'll be back next Wednesday for our class at our usual time, and I will look forward to having one more book discussion, and then we'll talk about the relationship between the book and the film in the following week. Thanks. One last announcement. The nominations for the next Mythgard Academy book have been officially opened by Dr. Powell here in the midst of the class. I saw the notification go by in the middle, so if you are on the Council of the Wise, you should go and check your email and start the conversation to nominate books for our next discussion. So anyway, thanks. We'll have some reports from Mythmoot for next time, including I'll probably tell you guys more on Wednesday this weekend at Mythmoot. I'm going to announce the next big project that I'm going to do, of course, with the third Hobbit film coming out. Riddles in the Dark is ending. It's not officially over yet. We've still got some things to finish up, but Riddles in the Dark is ending. So what am I going to do next? Got a big plan, which I'm really excited about. I'm going to announce that on Saturday at Mythmoot, and I'll talk to you guys a little bit about that next Wednesday as well. So thanks, everybody. Good night. I will see some of you this weekend, which I'm very excited about, and I'll talk with the rest of you next week. Thanks, everybody. Good night.